Buying a house in Australia right now is grim. You open realestate.com.au and see a 2-bed shoebox going for $1 million, and you might be thinking to yourself, is that price in monopoly money? And it's not just you, this is the reality of millions of people in Australia and even people worldwide in countries like the US, Canada, New Zealand and Sweden. So let's unpack exactly what's going on here, why it's bad, and most importantly, what we can do about it. And if you're new here, hi, I'm Queenie and I'm a licensed personal finance creator, and I'm here to help you make your money go further. I bought my first home 5 years ago when I was 23, and I honestly feel so grateful for that. So that's why I'm here creating content to help you get ahead as well, especially if you're feeling totally priced out. I want this video to give you hope. Keep in mind that this video is general advice only and not personal financial advice. You can read my full financial services guide in the description. So let's begin by going back to the 1970s. The average house price in Australia cost $20,000 to $30,000, and the average income was about $9,000. Fast forward to today, and the median house price in Sydney is $1.1 million, and the median household income is $95,000. What used to be a 3-to-1 ratio is now closer to a 12-to-1 ratio in our biggest cities. It's like expecting to pay $3 for a block of chocolate, but that block of chocolate is now worth $45, and it's not even fair trade or handmade in Switzerland. So this narrative about millennials and Gen Z just not working hard enough and buying too much avocado on toast is obviously not true. It's so much harder to get ahead these days. So if you're feeling like you're struggling, it's not your fault and you are not alone. But why exactly is this happening? This isn't just about interest rates. This is systemic. Here are the 5 main things that are driving this. First, there's low housing supply. We need 1.2 million homes in the next 5 years, but we're only building about 180,000 per year. New South Wales is already 120,000 homes behind its goal. There's also a lot of chaos in the construction industry. More than 3,000 construction companies went bankrupt last year, and productivity in home building has dropped by 12% over the past 30 years. There are also really difficult zoning restrictions in place in local councils. It's really difficult to build up and densify. Local councils are making it more difficult to build apartments and townhouses, even though this is something that we need. This is definitely something that I have noticed whenever I am traveling. Our cities in Australia tend to be quite flat and more spread out. We also have a lot of incentives for property investors, like negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts, which push more investors into the market. We've also had a lot of immigration, but we don't have the infrastructure to match. There was a massive immigration spike post-COVID, and the population is set to grow by 3.6 million by 2034. There's not just a housing crisis, but there's also a rental crisis as well. Buying a home is difficult, but so is renting. Rental vacancy rates are 1% nationwide, which is the lowest it's been since 2008. Rent has risen by 48% since the pandemic, and income has only increased by 19%. Rent now eats up 30 to 50% of people's income, which is officially considered housing stress. And let me tell you a personal story to really illustrate this. Back in 2015 or 2016, I moved out of home in with my partner Pablo, and we were looking to rent our first place in the inner west of Sydney. We found a 1-bedroom apartment for $450 a week. At the time, I was a student at uni, and I was also working casually in retail, and Pablo was doing an internship, so we barely had any money at all. We went to just one rental inspection and put a deposit down on the same day. And just like that, we had a home to live in. There were no questions asked and no references checked. Fast forward to a few years later, around 2022, Pablo and I had bought our first home, but we decided that we wanted to rent it out and then potentially rent-vest, so we were looking for another apartment to live in. So we started going to inspections, and they were honestly packed. Every property had dozens of people. We applied to around 3 different places, and even with good jobs and good salaries, we kept getting rejected. And the only reason we were able to rent this place was because we showed up to the inspection early and we started being friendly with the real estate agent, and she helped us fast track our application. So in just a couple of years, you can really see how much more difficult it is for people to rent places. And I honestly really do feel for students and young people that are looking to rent a place right now, because it's really tough. So here's where the wealth really is. In Australia, over 60% of household wealth is tied up in housing, and the top 20% of households own almost 2/3 of all the wealth. Most of that is tied up in property. So when house prices rise, the concentration of wealth rises in the hands of people that already own property. And as we discussed earlier, older generations definitely had a leg up when it came to the property market, since property prices were way more affordable back then when they were younger, and everyone else is just trying to play catch up. And to dive deeper into the housing crisis, we're going to chat to Allegra Spender, who was the MP for Wentworth. By the way, this is not sponsored and I was not paid to do this interview. I was really curious to hear from someone in politics to see what they have to say about the housing crisis and what they're going to do to fix it. So let's dive in. Can you just summarize for our audience about what is actually causing this housing crisis and the rental crisis?
Look, the biggest factor is really lack of supply of housing. That really is the heart of what it comes down to. So Australia has about 400 homes per 1,000 people. A country like France, where it's much, much cheaper to own or to rent a property, has around 600 homes per 1,000 people. You know, the OECD average is, significantly higher than where Australia's at. So what's really happened is we haven't built enough homes, particularly over the last 20 years. And what we've seen is wages have, gone up at twice the pace of housing. So people who used to, based on their wage, be able to buy a certain sort of site of house or apartment, just can't do it anymore unless their parents are helping.
One of the, topics that comes up when people are talking about the housing crisis is, you mentioned supply. That's definitely a big one. Some people also talk about property investors, potentially reducing incentives for property investors. Do you think that that would potentially alleviate the housing crisis situation, or do you think that this would have other impacts?
Sure. Look, I think if you say the biggest issue really is supply, and so you go, well, if we sort of made it less attractive for investors, would we have more supply? And I don't think the answer is yes. So I think, from a supply point of view, I don't think it would change. However, I do think that the tax incentives are tilted more towards investors than they are to homeowners at the moment. And so I think that there's a way of tilting those back to make it better for people who are trying to get into the market for themselves. And particularly the tax I hate the most in this space is stamp duty, because it's a tax on divorce, it's a tax on moving. And if you're someone who can't buy your forever home straight out, you have to be taxed every time you buy a house compared to someone else who could buy it straight out. So, I think tax should all be on the table. I personally think, we need to try and tilt the balance away from income tax on younger people, because that's, really a big burden of our tax system. But, I know the tax isn't a silver bullet answer to this. The biggest lever we can pull is actually supply.
I guess one of the things that we've noticed throughout this whole topic about the housing crisis, people say that millennials and Gen Z are often too lazy, and that's the reason why they can't afford property. What do you say to people that say that they're too lazy and need to work harder to afford property?
Look, it's completely unfair and untrue. That avocado toast, meme is completely wrong. And so I really stand up against that. But you need to look at the facts. And, the facts are that younger people spend about $1,000 less on non-essentials than they did a generation ago. So that's $1,000 less on, the fun stuff, fashion and going out and stuff like that, because more of their money is going into the essentials of rents, power and food.
Another thing that people talk about when they talk about the housing crisis, migration and immigration. Do you think that pausing or slowing down immigration temporarily would help with the housing crisis, or do you think that this would have other impacts for the economy?
So our current population is pretty much what we had thought it would be sort of 5 or 10 years ago. It really dipped down during COVID because no one came in, and then it's really spiked up in the last 2 years. And I get everyone has worried about that, saying, oh, look, it's lots of people have come in a time that housing's really difficult to get into. But I think the evidence is to say, look, it would have a probably relatively small impact in terms of housing affordability, but it doesn't really go to the heart of this, which is actually just the slowness of building. And, I think it's right to say we need to make sure our migration settings and our house building settings are aligned. The other side of this is also, though, with migrants, many of those migrants can have construction skills, but it can be pretty tricky for those to be recognised. I was actually just out in my community the other day, and a guy came up to me and said, he was a tradie, he was from Ireland, and he said it's taken him 1 year and $15,000 to get his qualifications from Ireland recognised here in Australia. And that means that we've got people here who can't use their skills to their full amount, which actually puts more pressure on us, particularly if in construction issues. And then finally, migration does matter for the rest of the economy. A significant amount of our permanent migration is family reunion, husbands, children, parents coming in, and a big part is also skilled workers. So you've got to get the balance right. And I think there are some reasons why we should sort of temper some of our migration, but it's not a sort of super easy silver bullet, and there will be other implications on the economy if you do something really draconian.
Yeah, for sure. And especially seeing the birth rate is so low as well.
I know, at 1.5, it's our lowest birth rate ever. I think a lot of that is down to housing. And certainly, I'm a child of a migrant, so, I know that Australia is a migrant country, and migrants have made a huge positive impact on Australia, including, on managing the birth rate. So it's you've got to be pretty careful, I think, with this, both on the economics, but also from the social policy point of view. I think you've got to be we've got to make sure that, we have a fact-based conversation, not one that tries to demonise a particular group.
Sure, completely agree. Also, daughter of a migrant as well, and yeah, agree. I think you've got to get the balance right, and it would be nice that, more Australians could see themselves having kids in the future, so hopefully
Absolutely.
we can fix this. What is the reason why we've been falling behind on building new homes, and how can we potentially solve these things from happening so there is more supply in the future?
Yeah, look, this isn't easy, but there are a couple of different things that are not working right now. So one of the big issues that we have is productivity in the construction sector has gone backwards by about 12% in the last couple of decades. That means it's more expensive to build the same thing than it was 20 years ago. That's a real problem. It also takes longer, and that's it takes around 50% longer to build a house now than it did, a couple of decades ago. So we've got to find a way to make it easier to build housing. Now, what's driving some of those low productivity issues? Part of it is regulation, getting the regulatory settings right, like the National Construction Code right. Part of it is councils and what they do. There's, I think, a lot of councils, I think the average council days, it's now taking 173 days to approve a building in Sydney. Now, the problem with that means that if someone's holding on to this asset, it just means it costs more money, which means it costs more to build, which means, fewer of these things, get built. So those sort of regulatory and slowness are issues. Partly it is also the skills and in the construction sector and how that is managed. And that's why I think it's really important to make sure, when we're bringing in construction workers, that we can use them to their full ability, because the cost of building stuff is expensive, and when the cost of building things are expensive, you just don't build as much. So it's a real combination of things. At the federal government, which is where I sit in the federal parliament, we don't control a lot of the sort of state and local issues, the planning issues, which make it difficult and expensive to build. But our job, I think, is to give the right incentives to the state and the local governments to get on with this, get faster, still consult with the community, but make this more efficient so that more houses can be built. Those are some of the big levers we can pull.
Yeah, and pretty much all levels of politics are all seem to be aligned on fixing this issue. What do you think about where will we go from here? Do you think it will get worse? Do you think it will get better? How long do you think it would take until we have a bit of relief from this?
Look, I think it has to get better, and I think that political pressure will help it get better. And I think just on the politics for a second, my view on this is that there are good ideas from a range of political parties and backgrounds, and the answer should be yes and rather than either or, because honestly, I look at the Labor Party, there's some good policies, there's some good policies in the coalition, but they don't, there are also some things that they won't even consider, and so it's got to be saying, well, this and this and this, rather than, it's got to be one or the other. That's sort of more on the politics side. Look, I think, I hope that it does get better. What makes me a bit hopeful is I think if interest rates come down, that helps in terms of incentives to build. And so if we get further interest rate cuts, that will help it, make it easier to build. In terms of migration, which I know people are worrying about, migration's already forecast to really come down substantially over the next 2 years, because there was a lot of sort of post-COVID catch-up on some of the migration figures, which sort of artificially inflated them for the last 2 years. So from that migration point of view, there will be less pressure, though, as I said before, I don't think it's the major driver. So I think we're going to, and I think we're seeing commitment at different levels of government to fix it. So that's good. but we've just got to keep the issue on the table and keep on standing up.
So now we know more about the problem, what can we actually do? I know Australia's housing market feels impossible, but there are definitely ways that you can still get ahead. So this section is all about focusing on practical solutions that we can do. While older generations definitely had a leg up when it came to property prices, the great thing that we have access to nowadays is the internet, and especially investing apps that make it super simple to start investing. You can get started investing in ETFs or even real estate investment trusts. Real estate investment trusts are essentially investment that you can buy on the stock market that gives you exposure to real estate. And it's more similar to a stock because you can easily buy it and sell it, and you can get started with as little as $5. So the way that I was able to save a $100,000 deposit by 23, I started investing in stocks, which enabled me to grow my deposit faster. And now 5 years after buying my first home, I've actually upgraded into a bigger home for our family. And I basically use the same process. So I think it's a really great tangible way that we can build our wealth and help secure our future, even if we may not necessarily have property yet. Another way that we can get ahead is by rent vesting. This is essentially renting where you want to live and investing where you can afford to buy. It's not for everyone, but for some people, it can be a great stepping stone into being able to buy their own home one day. Another tip is to buy what you can afford now and then upgrade later. This is personally what we did. As I mentioned, around 23 was when we bought our first property, which was a 2-bedroom unit. This place was definitely not giving luxury. The oven didn't work, the kitchen cupboards were hanging on for dear life, and the bathroom was really outdated. But because this was an old unit in a boutique block, we got a really good price on it. 5 years later, the value of our unit had grown, and we were also investing in stocks on the side, and this enabled us to buy a bigger home for our family, which we now live in, and we were able to rent that unit out. So just remember, your first home doesn't have to be your forever home, and you can always upgrade later just like we did. Another tip is to get some laser focus in where you actually spend your money and start budgeting. I actually built a budgeting tool called Billaroo to help you see where your money goes. And if you would like to check it out for yourself, I've got a link in the description below. Another tip is to learn and educate yourself about how to build wealth and how to succeed in this new economy. It is really difficult and it's a lot harder for young people than it used to be, but there are still things that we can do in order to get ahead. And finally, with the election coming up, it's also a really great chance for us to have a look at the politicians and see if their values align with our values, especially around housing affordability. So if that's something that you care about, it's really important that we put pressure on them to actually make those decisions that affect all of us. And if you're curious about which one has actually made me more money over the past 5 years, property versus real estate, you can check out this video up here. I do a full breakdown comparing the two. And trust me, the numbers may surprise you because they surprised me. If you found this video useful, give it a thumbs up and share it to somebody who needs to hear this. And write house in the comments if you made it to the end. Thank you so much. Bye.